ahead and introduce the panelists to you. Briefly introduce Susan Gervasi to you. I'll say a little bit more. Such an accomplishment this film is, historic. I'd also like to acknowledge Frank Gervasi, who's in the front row. Susan Gervasi is a journalist and documentary filmmaker, as you know. Susan has published more than 60 articles in the Washington Post, contributed to the Washington City Paper, and syndicated stories from the New York Daily News, San Francisco Chronicle, Detroit Free Press, and other major newspapers. Her 2008 documentary, which was one of the ones that preceded this, On the Trail of Jack Thorpe, won the Will Rogers Medallion Award for Film and screened at 4 U.S. film festivals. To her right is Dr. William Richards, who was in the film, as you know, who's a psychologist currently at the Psychiatry Department of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where he and his colleagues have pursued research with entheogens for 16 years. After encountering psilocybin research with Dr. Leuner, as you saw in the film, in Germany in 1963, he pursued psychotherapy research with LSD, DPT, MDA, and psilocybin at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. Columbia University Press has published his new book, which is brilliant. Get yourself a copy. Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics, and Religious Experiences, which is required as a textbook in the certificate program here in the center. And Reverend Mike Young, who's to the left of Susan, is currently the interim minister for the Emerson Unitarian Universalist Church in Canoga Park, California. He served Unitarian Universalist churches in 8 U.S. cities, and this represents 51 years of continuous ministry. A graduate of the Andover Newton Theological School, Reverend Young was one of the earliest Unitarian Universalist community ministers. He's been very active in the communities he's served and has received several awards for interfaith, interracial, and social justice activities. So we're really happy to have them here with us, so please welcome them with me. So we'll have ample time for you in the audience to ask all three of them questions, singly or as a group, but I like to jumpstart us and ask any of the three of you who'd like to respond to this. What do you feel now, looking back at the Marsh Chapel experiment 54 years ago? What's changed? What was the import of this work? If you'd like to comment on Walter Pankey's legacy and vision, any of the above.
Let Mike first speak because he was actually there.
It's an interesting question that I get asked with some frequency. Okay, what impact did that have on you, and how the hell do I know? I mean, you can't rerun your life to find out what would have happened if A, B, or C didn't happen or did happen. What I do know is that where it led me was to the recognition that mysticism, as we sloppily talk about it, that the name of the game is discovering how you really are connected, and then learning how to live out of that connection. That has been really the story of my life. I've done all kinds of strange things. I've been on both sides of this issue. I, for a while, worked with the juvenile court in Los Angeles, developing innovative programs for juveniles, and for a while carried a drug testing caseload. I've caught the bad guys, and I have worked on trying to keep the kids out of the system. I've served in churches primarily in Tampa, Florida, working in a variety of civil rights and justice, social justice issues. And I spent 14 years in Honolulu with what is, I think, the most interesting interfaith community that is imaginable. The Interfaith Alliance that we helped start, or at least continue when I got there, has 13 representatives from 13 different religions in it. Not denominations, religions. As a result, I have friends who are actually willing to talk to me across an incredible spectrum of cultural and ethnic and theological orientation. When I went into this, keep in mind, in the film, I'm the one that said, no, I got the drug, but this was not a religious experience. Because I came into it with the expectation that a religious experience was going to be recognizably, in some sense, religious. And by the end of the year afterwards, I had changed my mind. But it is arguable that the reframing that happened for me in that is responsible for some of the kinds of things that I've done that are a bit unusual for your average country pastor. But was it this? Was it the lead-up education that I had and background that I had that made me open to this that's responsible for that? There's no way of knowing.
I relate to this film on so many different levels. On one hand, it's seeing all my old friends, and it brings back many memories. Gee, there's even a shot of my wedding. You know, as the film said, if you caught it, I knew nothing about this when it happened. I wasn't part of the Good Friday study itself. I met Wally in Göttingen, Germany, in about a year and a half later, and we became very good friends. And when his degree was finally granted, I had the honor of giving him, or guiding him through his first psychedelic session. And he also was my guide in one of mine that was very important to me. So when it came time for my wedding, he indeed was my best man, and we had some of the photographs that Susan used, I actually took, of in the garden with Kristen and David, and and I remember when Ava Pankey and Wally looked like they do in the pictures there. There's a lot of happy memories there. I remember Kristen, when I first met Kristen, she was barely 3 years old. She was a little blonde toddler walking down the hallway of the dormitory where I was living. So we have a long history. At Hopkins, of course, we have repeated this experiment in a more systematic way, and certainly validated it. Right now, we are doing a study at Hopkins with professional religious leaders, clergy from different world religions, in which they get 2 high-dose psilocybin sessions. We're especially looking for Hindu priests and Islamic imams right now. If you happen to know any, please tell them that there's a fascinating project at Hopkins, and we would love to have them apply, and we have travel funds available for them if they need it. But my own fantasy is that the day will come when psychedelics will be used in an educational framework, in theological education. Never a required course, to be sure, but a legitimate weekend workshop for those who would like some primary religious experiences. Why not? It's non-addictive, essentially safe, drug when it's used wisely, and I think the time will come when that will not even be controversial. Right now, it still sounds pretty radical. In my book, there are 3 chapters on psychedelic frontiers in medicine, psychedelic frontiers in education, and psychedelic frontiers in religion. And I feel, all of these trajectories are worth a lot of energy and investigation. I think you ought to hear from Susan a bit about the making of the film.
Yeah. How did it change you?
Yeah.
Oh, it expanded my mind to meet so many interesting people like Mike and Bill and the Pankey family. I wanted to say, you ask about, Janice asked about the significance of the experiment, I think, and 40 years later. Of course, it's related to Hopkins, and I think I first heard about it in an article that Rick Doblin was in. I think that may have been the first time I heard about it. He put me on to Bill, who had been a good friend of Walter's. But I think the article was about the Hopkins research because around that time, it was on CNN, it was just everywhere. But I felt that Rick Doblin said something that really struck me, and that was that this was so historical, the first attempt to bring science and religion together, science and the mystical experience together, because the mystical experience is historic in terms of, saints and seers and people that stumbled across, psychedelics and, primitive times. But Walter was the one who said, well, let's test it out. And Tim Leary had been running sort of not informal, but, with his friends, were involved in his projects. And Walter came along and said, well, let's see if this is real. Let's find a way to do it. And first, let's find out what mysticism is. And as the film said, he studied it. But I think, the Hopkins research is a phenomenal and probably much more, so much more is known. And so it's much more systematic and probably safe. And I doubt they have people running out of the room, shooting them up with Thorazine, not so far, right? But
Not in 16 years, anyway.
not so far. But I noticed there was interesting reaction from people that when that came up, a lot of people seemed shocked or sighed, and I was just kind of curious about that reaction. I mean, and I felt like it kind of hangs there in the film, and I can't really explain it. It just happened. And but I think the significance is that it was the first time in humanity that somebody did something like this. And the other thing that I really wanted to say was what fascinated me about the experiment was that it was like cognitive dissonance. You have these young theology students, you probably wore suits to the Good Friday service, I'm guessing, maybe not. No, you didn't? Well, but I assume that they probably hadn't had more than a couple of beers and probably hadn't smoked pot. And here they were, taking one of the most powerful psychoactive drugs then known at the time. And I thought that was just incredible. And so, I don't know. That's all I have to say on that. But that it was the first time science and religion were sort of worked together. And of course, Hopkins has taken that to a much more profound level and much more complicated and carefully controlled experiments. But it was quite a first for humanity.
Thank you very much. So, welcome to your time. We've got 2 mics in the house, one on this side and one on the other. We're going to rotate side to side. So I believe someone has a mic over here. Can I see where the mic is? Okay, so can you raise your hands over here so she can give you the mic? There's one by the pillar over here.
Reverend Young, you said that that at the time you didn't recognize it as the experience you had as a mystical experience or a religious experience. What did you think that a religious experience was at the time, and what was your experience then that you would have described it as such?
Well, my experience of what my expectation of what a religious experience was, the expectation was wonderfully vague. It would certainly have some of the imagery or some of the mythic references from either the Christianity that I was in the process of getting kicked out of at the time. I may be one of the few people you will meet that's actually been through a heresy trial and thrown out. This was the Baptists, and the Baptists sent a letter to the church that did this, sent a letter to Baptist headquarters. And when I was talking with Dean Roy Pearson, trying to get into a particular project that I wanted into to do my internship, to be a campus minister at Denison University in Ohio, when I went to see to it that he had gotten the necessary documents sent to the right place, he says, "Have you ever seen your file?" I said, "No, I didn't know you had a file on me." And he said, "Well, yeah, when you applied, we checked you out with Baptist headquarters because you'd been raised a Baptist, and they sent this," and he tossed the letter across the desk to me that the church that tried me for heresy and fired me and sent to headquarters. And I looked at it and I said, "But why would you accept me into theological school having seen this letter?" And he said, "That's the reason why we accepted you." So what I want to make clear is that my expectations were not third grade Sunday school, okay? But I did expect that there would be something that picked up the cultural connections that I was familiar with, and I knew a good deal at that time about interfaith stuff. And the experience I had none of that in it. And one of the things that I have concluded is that the biggest lesson, one of the big lessons for me out of it, was stop paying attention to the images, the stories, the myth making of the human species. All of those come out of the same human experience, talked about differently and symbolized differently. Pay attention instead to the actual experience. So when somebody comes to me and has troubles with their belief, I'm not interested in their beliefs. I want to know what their actual experience is. And that's the thing that was one of the things that was really important coming out of this for me. And it dramatically changed my sense of what religion is about. It isn't about those things that you got taught in Sunday school.
If I can just add on that a little bit, also in psychedelic research and in non-psychedelic religious research in religious experience, we know that there's a whole spectrum of religious experiences. There's not anything called the religious experience, but there are mild senses of the presence of the divine, of conversion experiences, of working through grief and guilt and having a sense of forgiveness. We call that a religious experience. Then there are these visionary states of seeing a vision of the Christ or the Virgin Mary or the Buddha or whatever it is, and feeling the sense of awe and devotion and a sense of personal relationship or connection. And those are profoundly meaningful to people when they happen. And then, if you will, beyond that is what we call the mystical consciousness that is usually expressed in the language of Hinduism, really, as the drop of water of the everyday self merging with the ocean of Brahman. or what Paul Tillich called the ground of being, which is much more abstract, and it involves the death and rebirth of the ordinary personality. For religious scholarship, what's so incredible and what makes these drugs so valuable in religious research as well as medicine is that we can now study all these different states, and we know that they seem to be part of the repertoire of being human. That it's not just that Hindus happen to have the unitive experience and Christians have the personal relating to Jesus, but both Christians and Hindus, it appears, can experience both of these states of consciousness, that it's part of the human repertoire rather than something culturally imposed. And that opens up an incredible frontier. I mean, for so many years, study of mysticism has been reading Saint Teresa of Avila and Rumi and Saint John of the Cross and Meister Eckhart and Shankara, these ancient documents, and trying to read them in the original languages to get close to them. Now, or studying the scriptures of Isaiah's temple vision and Moses with his burning bush and St. Paul on the road to Damascus, and the early disciples with the vision of the transfigured Christ and so on. Profound religious experiences. But now these experiences are happening, literally, in the laboratories of social scientists. And we can study them. We can study how people think and behave before those experiences happen and after the experiences happen. And are they just wonderful bursts of emotion, or do they really have impact on our ethics and our ways of thinking and our ability to get engaged in social change, et cetera, et cetera? And it makes it possible to do empirical research in religious experience. And that's an incredibly exciting frontier. And I'm waiting for a few departments of religion to start collaborating with their colleagues in the School of Medicine and get some really fascinating studies going.
My wife had her hand up before anybody else did. Said she was as near to there as anybody else here.
Thank you. Have you noticed in your, well, my reason for asking this is that when Mike and the group were training, and they did a lot of training ahead of time to prepare them for the experience, one of the sessions they all brought a partner who would be with them after the experience and told us a little bit what to watch for and how to help or how to listen. And I was very jealous. And I asked Tim Leary, couldn't some of us be in it? And he said, no, he really wanted that. He didn't want to make the experiment more different by having females in it also. And I'm wondering if you've seen any difference in the way women respond to the way men respond in your experience. Thank you.
The simple answer to that is no. That it seems to be a very human experience, not only male and female, but different races, different expectations, different educational levels. I often say it appears to me that what's most important is that the person who receives psilocybin has a sense of trust and openness. They can call themselves an agnostic if they want. That's perfectly fine, as long as they're trusting and open. I suspect the people who would have trouble letting go, really trusting would be either kind of extreme self-defined atheists or very rigid believers in one theological system or another, who felt they had a point they wanted to prove, because that's an agenda of the ego. And the ego has to be willing to relinquish control and awaken to these deeper universal states of consciousness. We do have women now in our studies, let me assure you. In fact, even some of our finest guides are women. So.
I've got one thing I want to add. Sure.
Because one of the things that has bothered me about the response, as I have over the 50 years talked about this, an awful lot of people want to look to the psychedelic experience as validation and proof of their theological, ideological prejudices. Not enough to go get firsthand experience, but because my experience of it was not denominational, ideological, and my interfaith experience is that we all get along, that interfaith group I mentioned to you, precisely because our relationship is based on our interpersonal relationships and the willingness to share our differing experience with one another, not our attempts to rationalize or convince that a particular ideology is so.
For Susan and Frank, actually, you interacted with a bunch of the people who got placebo in that experiment, and there was at least one placebo responder who had a religious experience, and I'm wondering what impact it had on the other people who got placebo.
I really wish that I didn't have access to, obviously, most of the people that were in that study. I couldn't find them, or they had passed on. I don't know if Rick Doblin was able to interview everybody, but the question is the placebo takers. And all I know is that the two people in my film, I don't know about Ron Hafer up in Boston, but Mike and Randy both became ministers. Other people that there was a guy named George Lawson. Oh, you want to know about the placebo takers? Let me go through the actual people want to know. George Lawson, who I did interview, but I wasn't able to use it, actually got it with Bill, and in 1966, they were still doing some research, and so he had, with Bill and Walter together, I think they injected the psilocybin at that time, or was it still pills? I don't know. I thought it was
Probably pill. It could
Pill.
have been injection.
Okay, so he didn't talk. I really wanted him to talk about what that was like to be someone that was just a bystander, and he just didn't really want to talk about it. He wanted to talk about how profound his subsequent experience was. I got from a couple of the placebo takers I found, it's hard to say. I didn't feel, and Mike's a good friend of Wayne's, who was a placebo taker, and I think they were sitting by each other in the experiment, and I don't know, I couldn't really detect, he tried to get it, and I couldn't really detect if he regretted not getting it. The other person, Ben Griffin, who interestingly became president of Andover Newton at some point, he's retired now, he said in the film, he says, I was really happy I didn't get it, and I believe that about him. I think he was just as happy. I think what I discovered, I think it was a much, now Mike can talk about this, but from the perspective of these people and Tim Leary and Ralph Metz, or Paul Lee, it was just kind of a wild day, but I think Mike, you were so involved with your own experience that you weren't noticing much about what was going on, right?
Much of the time, yeah, but I do know the person who was the one who got the placebo, who claimed that they'd had a religious experience. Oh yeah, and those of us who did get the drug scoff at this whole idea. Because he would have considered a very mildly pleasing poem a religious experience. And once he began hearing what had happened to the rest of us, now the sequence here was such that immediately after this was all over, we had to go talk into a tape recorder and then longhand write out what our experience had been, and then answer the question, was this a religious experience or not? It was only after that particular gentleman began to hear us talking amongst ourselves about what our experiences had been. He had already answered the question. Yes, it was a religious experience, but he knew damn well it wasn't the same kind of experience that we had.
That's very interesting. I know that, so. Yeah, sure.
Reverend Ning, I have a question. 54 years is a long time, and this was clearly a seminal experience for you. In the interim, what has been your attitude, philosophy about the use of these substances as a means of developing one's spirituality? You've no doubt mentored thousands of people. How has this come into play in your own mentoring and development as a spiritual guide, if you will?
Well, the thing is complicated because one of the things it isn't in the movie, and that you don't know until I tell you now, is that for the first many, many years, the only participant in the experiment that was willing to talk to the media outside at all was me. Because all of these guys were either Baptists or Congregationalists, or because it was a Baptist and Congregationalist school. And they were all, quite frankly, worried that if anybody found out before they retired that they had participated in anything like this, it could cost them their jobs. So for years, I'm the one that got the phone calls. I'm the one that got the invitations from people like her to talk about this. And one of the things that did over the years was to keep my experience of it kind of constantly renewed, to the point that I would love to be able to go back and listen to the audio tape that I made after the thing, or to read the document that I read after the thing. Because one of the things I know about human memory is that the more times you tell the story, the more opportunities to edit the story. Has this become an even more important and significant event in my life than in fact it was, because I've told the thing so many times? And I have some caution about that. But having been involved both for 13 years in law enforcement, having been involved in a variety of different kinds of spiritual experience, as well as just plain pastoring 8 different congregations. I see this thing as profoundly promising. The hitch is who gets to control it. Because none of this, those of you who are getting trained as trip sitters, very few of you are going to get any opportunity to do this until these drugs are taken off Schedule 1. It just ain't going to happen unless you're willing to get involved with the underground supply network, which is out there. And this impacts also the issues of the places where we already have projects going on, clinical use projects going on, particularly with intractable pain patients, with folks who are terminal patients, with PTSD, with domestic violence. The opportunity to use some of these substances to reframe the destructive experience and reconstitute it and reevaluate it in the light of that reframing is just an incredibly potentially valuable tool. but it is also an incredibly potentially a destructive tool in the hands of idiots. We saw what happens when it is put in the hands of idiots, where they throw a fistful of pills in the middle of the floor and say, grab one and see what it feels like. I'm real hesitant, and we'll be watching carefully the way this moves across, because it needs to move, and it needs to move in a responsible fashion. And the usual people who are in the position of monitoring these kinds of things, by personality type, tend to be the least reliable at being the ones that regulate it. You do not want those folk that wouldn't even let us have marijuana that was of reliable quality. You wouldn't want those people being in charge of the protocols and procedures for using it responsibly. And there are a lot of them out there who would love to volunteer for the role. But, so it's sticky.
Yeah. Here. I think this question is for Susan. I'm fascinated by the history that you tell here. But I was hoping that you could say more about what triggered Harvard's reaction to sequester the drug. It sounded in the film like it was rumors that Timothy Leary had suggested that during the study the guides would also be using psilocybin. Did you mean to imply that? And was that really what triggered Harvard to react in the way it did?
What happened was in March, Leary, there was some kind of a staff meeting, and these colleagues, some of them felt he was being reckless. He and Albert were being reckless with these, volunteers. And so they kind of, the school newspaper, the Crimson, published an article, and some of the major media picked this up, and news that Harvard professors were doing this. They weren't fired at that time, and he was barely able. They were finally, like I said in the film, he was ordered at that time to turn over his psilocybin, but he wasn't fired at that time. Whether he turned over all of his psilocybin to Harvard, I don't know. And when I asked Ram Dass, he said, I went out on the street and got some. I said, oh yeah, where was that? And he was like, well, he wasn't going to tell me. So the firing of Leary and Alpert, I think Leary was just suspended, had to do with an allegation, and I think it may have been true, that Alpert had given a psilocybin to an undergraduate, and Harvard didn't want undergraduates being involved in this. But mainly, I think Harvard, just its reputation was stained, and I know Bill said feels they were reckless the way they conducted the research, and so does that make sense? It was really, the firing came after the Good Friday experiment, and the straw that broke the camel's back was, I believe, this incident with the student. Does that make sense?
So this was 1962.
Right.
This was before the anti-war movement and before
Drugs are still legal.
Psychedelics.
Oh yeah, the drugs were still legal. I think LSD was legal till 65 or something like that. So all the research they were doing on campus was legal, but once people started getting upset about this, Harvard laid down some laws like, okay, we're going to control the psilocybin and hand it out to you to do your experiments. You're not going to just have all this stuff, and that was, that's how that happened.
You did mention that there had been a proposal to have the guides also use them during the experiment. Is that right?
Right, and that was one of the arguments Pankey and Leary had. And both Kristen and her mother kind of, I think, remembered that there was bad blood over that issue of giving the guides psilocybin. And today, I'm sure the guides at Hopkins don't take psilocybin. But, Leary's guides were part of his crowd, as far as I can tell. They had all had experiences with it. Houston Smith was part of the crowd, and they were now, obviously, like when Houston Smith is having his religious experience, I don't know if he did chase the guy and try to track him down, the guy that escaped and kind of, had those issues. So I don't know how he handled that at the same time being on psilocybin. But I think the goal was to test. I think half the guides got it. I think it was part of the plan. But Pankey didn't want that, nor did he. Leary wanted him to take it before he gave it to other people, and he didn't want to do that because, as Bill has stressed, his reputation was at stake and his impartiality was in stake, and he didn't do anything until they met up in Europe and he had got his PhD approved, and that's when he did it. You want to comment on that, Bill?
Yeah, it's also hard to imagine, but at that time, these drugs were legal. And Sandoz was sending them through the mail to any psychiatrist who wanted to try them out with his patients. And they'd simply arrive and you say, well, try this, let's see what happens. And it wasn't controversial. And I remember I was, of course, in Germany when I read about Leary and Metzner and Alpert in Time magazine. This is the first I heard about it, and I thought, gee, they called it a scandal. And, in Göttingen, the drugs were legal, and, many medical students were taking them as part of their education, and we were experimenting very, very freely, and it was simply an interesting, promising new substance. And it's almost hard to imagine what it was like in those days, but it was very different.
So what I discovered, just doing research in old newspapers where I could find anything about this, was I think the media played a huge part in the demonization of the drugs and the demonization of Leary, who obviously had faults and flaws. But one story I wanted to share that I thought shows you how demonized, it was almost like overnight. By 63, people were thinking, well, LSD, because that kind of became the drug everybody knew about, because as Bill says, the other one is hard to pronounce and hard to spell, that but it was, a new drug, this can help. But then all of a sudden there was a change, and all of a sudden there were horror stories in the media, mostly about LSD. And but to me, what I noticed was that, well, Paul Lee, who was in there, he was a pretty good friend of Leary's. And Leary was really demonized by the late 60s. And Leary and Rosemary, his wife, were in Santa Cruz, and they were going to stay overnight with Paul in his house. And a neighbor across the street from Paul saw Tim Leary going into the house or something and chewed Paul out for even, having the hospitality to have this ogre, this kind of national menace. It just tells you what the mood had become. I don't know how it was at Spring Grove. That really fascinates me because they did some incredible studies there. Some with parapsychology, I think. Was Eileen Garrett actually studied there at one point? Or?
I don't recall if we ever did any direct research with Eileen, but yeah, I knew Eileen. In fact, I did a year at Andover Newton, a master's in psychology of religion with Walter Houston Clark that Eileen was nice enough to pay for. Will always be indebted to her. Eileen Garrett was a very fascinating woman. She was head of the Parapsychology Foundation in New York and was very bright. And she had helped a very wealthy person who left her quite a fortune. And so she had an estate in southern France, in Nice, called Le Piole, the Plow. And she would invite psychiatrists and researchers, physicists, engineers from all over the world, and pay them to come to her villa and lounge beside her pool for 2 weeks and be fed opulently to study her. And then when she would go into trance, there were 3 sub-personalities that would manifest. Actually, I think 4 ultimately, sub-personalities that would manifest. But she had a very critical mind and was very interesting and interested. And she was especially interested in ololiqui, the morning glory seeds. Yeah, she was quite remarkable in those days. Not at all the stereotypical psychic medium. Quite very intelligent. I know I went on that tangent, but you don't get to talk about Eileen Garrett very often.
I have one more sort of funny story. You remember Randy in the movie? He's a Swedenborgian, and he told me that after the experiment, he wanted it again. And he wanted to take it again, and he went to Leary and Alpert and told them, or maybe just Leary, that he wanted some counseling. He needed counseling, but his goal was really to try to get some psilocybin. And so I believe he said that they recommended morning glories. That made me think of that. Yeah.
I'd like to say one thing.
Yeah.
About the cultural context at the time this happened. Even though the drugs were legal, there had been already some experiments, not only there, but around in Europe going on. It is also true, when you look at Harvard's response, when you look at Andover Newton Theological School's response, they did not acknowledge that this occurred until the year that Ben was made president. For the first time, the document was permitted to be in the library. That was in the 80s. The same thing is true of the academic atmosphere at the time. Most of the academics that were interested, like you and a few others, were terribly worried that Tim's recklessness was going to make the world really, really difficult for them, which is exactly what it did. And so that back of this problem with Harvard are a lot of issues of control and power. And one of the things that neither Albert nor Larry were good at was managing people who are worried about control and power. And as Walter has been described, he was rather resistant to being controlled and having power over him either. And you know, in academia, control and power is really, really important. It may be important, more important than how much you're getting paid.
Also important to know that we have just
One more question for you. In an academic institution, there's a gentleman over here who'd like to ask you a question, and then we'll have to close.
Sure.
Thank you. So this is actually kind of relating some of the threads that have already been talked about. It seems to me that there's a zeitgeist happening now where spirituality and consciousness is really re-burgeoning and growing again, similar to the 60s, and history ebbs and flows. Examples are legalization happening. Examples are what Ram Dass has done with kirtan and the growth of yoga and meditation, Eastern spiritual practices. Central Daime Church, which is now incorporating ayahuasca as a weekly ritual for people who go as part of their daily lives, as part of their spiritual practice. Where do you guys see this going, or where would you like it to go? And what lessons can we take from the 60s and what happened after the 60s, so that those who are living here now can take from that and possibly not make the same mistakes or act with greater wisdom.
One thing it's not that Larry didn't say it, but one thing we really know at this time is that the response to these substances is so much more than a chemotherapeutic response. You know, you don't take psilocybin to get rid of your neurosis the way you take aspirin to get rid of a headache. Or it just doesn't work that way. And we know that the expectation, the learning how to navigate in these internal worlds is incredibly important. And I think at this point in time, for anyone who chooses to take these substances, there is information available. Books like Jim Fadiman's The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide and so on. I like to hope my own book will help educate the masses. But if you're interested in psychedelics, you can kind of learn how to go about it in a way that's likely to be positive and helpful. And I don't think that situation was there a decade ago even. You know, that many people were just kind of floundering in the dark and, you know, taking psychedelics and wandering through shopping centers and thinking that was cool, you know. And I think both the medical use and the religious use, especially as expressed in the ayahuasca communities right now, is commanding a seriousness and a respect. And that should result in less people showing up in emergency rooms in paranoid states, you know? We'll see.
I'd like to acknowledge too, Bob Jesse is here this evening, and he is a big part of helping me, and I wondered if Bob could stand up, and, you know, he's a big part of supporting the Hopkins research, and is, you know, good guy.
Look, one of the things I mentioned in the movie is that in the middle of my whatever it was you want to call what happened to me, I died. And it is interesting every morning to wake up and try to figure out once your ego has died, what the hell are you supposed to do with the cadaver?
Are we going to end on that? I have one more thing to say, Bill. Go ahead.
Well, we know that after death, usually there's rebirth.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Before we say goodbye to them, I have some good news. Frank Gervasi is in the front by the door, and he brought some copies of the film for you to purchase, should you like to. So let's bid these fine folk adieu, and Susan, congratulations on this landmark film.